Ever get this, like, nagging feeling that some of those scientific facts we kind of take for granted might be a little off?
Off. How do you mean?
Well, not necessarily wrong, but maybe not the whole story. Like, we're finding out more and more that some of those classic studies in psychology, the ones everyone's heard of, well, the results aren't always holding up when you try to replicate them.
Ah, you're talking about the replication crisis. Yeah, it's a big concern in the field right now.
Exactly. And that's what makes today's deep dive so fascinating. We're diving into the work of Remy Thériault, who not only breaks down this replication problem, but also offers up open science as a potential solution.
And it's not just some abstract solution either. Thériault gets into the nitty-gritty of how open science can actually change the way research is done.
Right, which I appreciate because I'll admit, when I first heard open science, I was like, okay, so everyone just shares their notes. What's the big deal? But it's so much more than that.
It really is a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
But to understand why it's so important, we kind of have to rewind and look at why we're having this replication crisis in the first place. And one of the key things Thériault points to is this imbalance between exploratory research and confirmatory research.
Okay, break that down for me. What's the difference?
So imagine you're a researcher, right? You've got this new idea, this uncharted territory you want to explore. That's exploratory research. You're looking for something new, something interesting. And then you have confirmatory research, which is more about taking those initial findings and really putting them to the test, making sure they hold up under rigorous scrutiny.
So it's like the difference between, say, discovering a potential gold mine versus actually analyzing the ore to see how much gold is really there.
Exactly. And the problem is there's often a much stronger incentive to go for the shiny new discovery rather than doing the less glamorous but equally important work of confirming those discoveries.
And that has consequences, clearly.
Absolutely. And it can lead to a situation where research findings are less reliable than they should be.
And that's where those questionable research practices come in. Because Thériault drops a pretty startling statistic in his paper, apparently. Over 90% of researchers admit to engaging in at least one questionable research practice.
Yeah, that's the one that really makes you stop and think.
90%. That's huge. But we're not talking about straight-up fraud here, right? Like fabricating data.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Thériault is careful to distinguish between, like, outright scientific misconduct and these more subtle practices that can still skew the results. Things like what's called packing.
P-hacking.
Yeah, it's basically where researchers might analyze and reanalyze their data in a bunch of different ways until they get a statistically significant result, even if it means ignoring certain data points or not being entirely transparent about how they got there.
So it's kind of like cherry-picking the data to fit the conclusion you wanted all along.
Pretty much. And then you have things like harking, hypothesizing after the results are known.
Okay.
It stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. So say you do a study and you get some unexpected results. Instead of acknowledging that it was unexpected, you go back and tweak your hypothesis to fit the data you ended up with.
Ah, so it's like saying, I knew it all along, when in reality, you kind of reverse engineered your theory.
Exactly. And these practices, even if they're not done with malicious intent, they chip away at the integrity of the research. And it all contributes to this bigger issue of why we're struggling to replicate some of those classic findings.
So we've uncovered some pretty big problems with the way research has been done, and it can feel a little, I don't know, disheartening. Like, should we even trust what we're reading?
It's a valid concern, for sure. But the thing about Thériault's work, it's not just about, pointing fingers and saying everything's broken. He offers some really concrete solutions. And that's where open science comes in.
Okay, so remind us, how does open science actually address some of these problems we've been talking about?
Well, one of the big ones is this idea of pre-registration.
Pre-registration.
Yeah, it sounds kind of jargony, but the idea is actually pretty simple. Before you even start collecting data for your study, you basically lay out your entire research plan, your hypothesis, your methods, everything, and you make it public.
So you're kind of registering your study with the scientific community. Like, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're doing it.
Exactly. And the beauty of that is it eliminates that wiggle room for researchers to, say, tweak their methods after the fact or adjust their hypothesis to better fit the data they ended up with.
So it's like a built-in accountability system. You're less likely to try any funny business if you know your whole plan is out there for everyone to see.
Right. And what's interesting is it's not just about catching those bad actors. Pre-registration also encourages researchers to be more thoughtful and transparent about their work from the very beginning.
Because if you know your methods are going to be publicly scrutinized, you're going to make sure they're rock solid.
Precisely. Now, pre-registration is a big step in the right direction. But Thériault argues that registered reports take this idea of transparency even further.
Registered reports. Okay, now you're really losing me.
Okay, so imagine this. You're a researcher, and you have this great idea for a study. But instead of just going ahead and doing the study, you first submit your research plan, your whole proposal, to a journal for peer review.
Hold on, you're saying they review the study before it's even been done?
Yep. And here's the really radical part. The journal decides whether or not to publish your study based on the strength of your research design, not on whether you got statistically significant results.
Wow, that's a game changer. Because it takes away that pressure to find something groundbreaking or whatever, and it lets researchers focus on asking important questions, even if the answers might not be flashy or exciting.
Right. And it also helps combat that publication bias we talked about earlier, where journals are more likely to publish studies with positive results.
So it levels the playing field a bit, makes sure that even studies with null results or results that don't fit the initial hypothesis have a chance to see the light of day.
I like it. Okay, so pre-registration, registered reports, it seems like transparency is the name of the game here. But Thériault also talks about this idea of open data, open materials, and even open source software. And that's where I start to get a little, I don't know, skeptical maybe. Like, is it really realistic to expect researchers to just share everything? It's a fair point.
Okay.
And of course, you always have to consider things like data privacy and confidentiality. You can't just go around sharing sensitive information willy-nilly. But when it's done ethically and responsibly, sharing research materials has the potential to be hugely beneficial for the field as a whole.
Okay, but what are the actual benefits? Paint me a picture. What does this look like in practice? So if I'm getting this right, we're talking about giving other researchers access to, like, everything. The data itself, the materials they used, even the code for their analysis.
Exactly. It's about making the whole research process more transparent.
Okay, I see how that fits with the whole transparency thing, but what's the actual upside? Like, what do we gain from all this sharing?
Well, for one thing, it allows for better verification. Other researchers can actually go in and check the work, see if the data really supports the conclusions, maybe even spot errors or inconsistencies that the original researchers missed.
So it's like a super-powered peer review.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it also opens up a whole world of possibilities for new discoveries. Because now, researchers can take data from multiple studies, maybe even combine it in new and interesting ways, and look for patterns and connections that wouldn't have been obvious before.
So it's not just about checking each other's work, it's also about building on it, taking that data and doing something new with it.
Exactly. And that brings us to the open source software piece.
Hmm.
You know, a lot of research these days involves using specialized software for analyzing data, right? Well, with open source software, those tools are freely available to everyone. Thériault specifically mentions R, which is this statistical programming language that's become really popular in psychology. And the idea is that by using and sharing open source software, you're kind of leveling the playing field. Everyone has access to the same tools, which makes it easier to collaborate and build on each other's work.
It's like instead of everyone hoarding their own fancy tools, we're all sharing a really awesome public workshop. I like that analogy.
Right. It changes the whole dynamic.
It does. Okay, so we've covered pre-registration, registered reports, open data, open software. Phew, is there anything else?
Well, we can't forget about preprints and open access publishing.
Right, those are the ones I always get a little fuzzy on. They both seem to be about making research more accessible, but I'm never quite sure what the difference is.
Yeah, it can be a little confusing. So think of it this way. A preprint is like the early version of a research paper. It's like the author saying, hey, this was what we found. What do you think? And they put it out there for other researchers to read and comment on before it goes through the whole formal peer review process.
So it's like a sneak peek behind the curtain of academic publishing.
Exactly. And open access publishing, on the other hand, is about making the final published versions of those papers freely available to anyone who wants to read them.
Ah, okay. So preprints are about sharing research earlier, and open access is about making sure that research is accessible to everyone, not just people with expensive journal subscriptions.
Got it.
Wow, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but I think the main takeaway here is that open science is about so much more than just like sharing your notes or whatever.
Yeah.
It's really about changing the entire culture of research, making it more transparent, more collaborative, and ultimately more trustworthy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And at the end of the day, it's about making sure that the benefits of scientific discovery reach as many people as possible.
Well said. That's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us and for shedding light on this incredibly important topic. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep asking questions, keep exploring, and let's all work together to build a more open and trustworthy scientific future. Until next time.